welcome to the discussion on dynamics of migration in India. This discussion relates to our MA program in Sociology, especially MSO 004 Sociology in India. Migration has always remained an integral part of human mobility. It's related to a process of spatial mobility immediately. It's also linked to economic and social mobility. This mobility is linked to generation of population, socio-cultural location of the population, and also spatial location of the population. Before we go in depth about this discussion, let us try to understand what do we mean by migration in common parlance. When we talk about migration, we usually talk about it's the movement of people from one place to another with the intention of settling permanently or temporarily at a new location. Usually talk relates to a geographical location. So what is important? It is the movement of people from one place to another with the intention of permanently or temporarily settling down. Movement also takes place regularly. Many of the people move from one location to another, maybe to do some economic activity for some job. But those are usually commuting, daily commuting. But when people are moving with the intention of settling, that is important, there is an intention of settling permanently or temporarily, that's related to our migration. So migration, usually it is a moving away from the place of residence to a place of doing a job or place of doing another kind of settlement. Many of the migration may not be economic. When you are talking about migration for the purpose of settling, that may be for the purpose of job. It may be for non-economic purpose. Somebody is going for a longer period of time for a study, somebody getting married, or somebody may be getting dislocated for some physical reason or otherwise, maybe for political reason. So those are also part of a migration. So what is important to keep in mind, migration is the movement of people from one place to another with the intention of settling. That is our first point to begin with. So when we talk about migration, we also encounter another term, immigration. We also encounter the term emigration. So when you talk about the immigration is usually used, that is commonly used term that is defined somebody is coming to a foreign country with the intention of settling there or living there. That is we call it immigration. So immigration mostly linked to an international phenomenon. Like immigration, there is also immigration, that is relocation from one home country to another. That is when people is immigrating, that is going to a foreign country, but with the relocating from the home country, it becomes an immigrant. So somebody is an immigrant in his home country when he is moving to another country because with the intention to go there, but when he is going and settling there, he is becoming an immigrant. The process is that when somebody is starting a process of relocation in another country, he becomes an immigrant. But when he settles there, he becomes an immigrant. This is the whole process of movement is linked to shifting for the economic purpose. That is the process of relocation in matter of immigration. So we have encountered three terms now. One is that what we call this migration, immigration, and emigration. I believe these things are clear. This will be more clearer if I give you an example. That is, same person may be an immigrant and an immigrant. For example, when someone moves from Delhi to Kolkata, he becomes an immigrant from Delhi. But when he settles in Calcutta, he becomes an immigrant in Calcutta. That is a kind of definition. But since it's an international phenomenon, we have to take into consideration when somebody moves from Delhi to London, he becomes an immigrant, but when he settles in London, he becomes an immigrant. So all these phenomena are widely linked in terms of movement, physical movement, spatial movement, and spatial mobility of people. And it's also one of the important components of urbanization. In India, if we look into that is the process of urbanization, process of migration, in India, process of migration is widely linked to process of urbanization in India. As we told earlier, that is when you look into the whole process of urbanization, we talk about a process of mobility of the people from rural to the urban areas, a kind of a demographic component we take into consideration. So when you talk about the migration in Indian context, majority of the migration in Indian context is linked to rural to urban migration. That is one of the political, economic and demographic concern when you talk about. When you talk about this migration, it is also widely linked to one's what we call livelihood question and economic survival question it comes in, especially in the context of rural to urban migration. As the urban India has emerged to be the haven of hope for employment, haven of hope for education, and haven of hope for social mobility, the Urban Commission of India in 1986, it talked about that is, since there is a process of surplus labor in the rural area, especially among the landless laborer, among the Harijans and Adivasis, they want to move out to the cities. And for them, the urban area has emerged to be a haven of hope for the fulfillment of their aspiration. So what we find, urban area has emerged to be a haven of hope for urban aspiration. But when there is an aspiration, this aspiration is guided by two important factors. One is a push factor. Why somebody will leave for one home to look for job in another place, to look that one to be a haven of hope? It is because of this fact that in rural India experiences the enormous process of unemployment, and this unemployment pushes a huge number of the people to move from rural to the urban areas. This we call a kind of a push factor of migration. This push factor of migration is linked to three important components. One is that gradual declining landman ratio in India. When India got independent, we had got at that point of time 2.5 hectare of land per household. Now that landman ratio has declined to the extent of only 0.5 hectare per household. If we look in terms of landman individual ratio, it was roughly around 0.5 hectare per person in 1947. Now it has declined to 0.09 hectare per person in 2017. So what you find, a gradual declining in the landman ratio in rural area. When there is landman ratio, declining landman ratio, obviously there will be unemployment. How this unemployment is reflected? In terms of increasing number of marginal worker in rural India. In 1980, proportion of the marginal worker, those who are not getting more than 180 days of job, rather those who are getting less than 180 days of job, they are the marginal worker. They are only 10% of the rural household. Their proportion has increased in 2011 to the extent of 31% of the rural household. What we find, the number of the marginal worker, those who are unemployed or underemployed or semi-employed, their proportion to the rural population has increased. The casual workers, the agricultural laborer, there has been phenomenal increase. The agricultural laborer, they are constituting roughly around 18% of the rural household in 1961. Now they constitute roughly around 33% of the rural household. So number of the agricultural laborer has increased. Marginal worker has increased. So what we find, when they are not getting employment, they will try to push gradual to the urban areas. Because of those factors, unemployment, landlessness, a huge number of the people are moving towards the push to move to the urban areas, the push factor. There is also another pull factor. Pull factor is that it is in terms of providing the opportunities of easy employment. When the rural people, the poor people, precisely coming to the urban areas, they look for immediate employment, and urban area gives is in a position to provide those employment. In the construction sector, the huge employment comes in, and also in the areas of so many hazardous activities, the housekeeping, the office keeping, the gardening, the varieties of the new activities, those are opened up in the urban areas. So what do you find? There is a combination of push and pull factor that has attracted and compelled a huge number of the people come from the rural areas, from rural to the urban areas in terms of employment. If we look at the whole quantum of the migrant population of India, now at this point, let me make one point clear, is that it is not only the agricultural laborer, sharecroppers, tenant, or rural poor artisan migrating to the rural to the urban areas. A sizable number of the rural youth, the educated youth, they are also migrating from rural to the urban areas in search of employment, because the kind of education they have acquired, kind of skill they have acquired, rural areas are not in a position to provide full employment. So there has been a process of migration of the educated rural unemployed and educated rural youth from the rural to the urban areas in search of employment. The 1911 census widely talked about that is 45 crores of population, that is 37% of Indian population are migrant in 2011. This figure now people estimate that it has gone up to more than 50 crores of population now. In 2016, they are the migrant population all over country. They are migrating from one part to other part of the country. That migration may be from one district to another district, maybe within the state. It may be from one district to another district outside the state, that is rural to rural migration. But there has also been another migration, that is migration from rural area to the urban areas. And if we look at the migrant workforce, precisely those who are working in the unorganized sector, the Economic Survey Government of India 2016 it talks about that 20% of the urban workforce they're comprised of these migrant workers. That is every seasonally they're migrating from the rural to the urban areas. Unfortunately, there is no scientific basis that to give a scientific, make a scientific projection or make a scientific conclusion, so that to talk about the size of the people, those who migrated from the rural to the urban areas, because many of the people migrating from the one part of the village to another part of the village, or one part of the district to another part of the district to another part of the country. So there is no statistics, but ILO has talked about more than 30 million people belong to the category of the migrant worker in our country. The Economic Survey widely talked about those who migrate from the rural to the urban areas. 90% of them get absorbed in the informal sector of the economy. By informal sector of the economy, we talk about a sector where the employment is not guided by the rules and regulation in terms of insurance of the social security, insurance of minimum wage or minimum hours of the work, or the social security arrangement. So what we find that they mostly get absorbed in the unorganized sector, and they mostly remain occupied with the low-paying, hazardous activities in the construction, in the hotel, in the textile, in the transport, and also in the domestic sector. So we find that this is the quantum of migration, the migrant worker in our country, and also the areas where they usually get absorbed. If we look into the social character of the migrant worker, that is quite interesting, is that when we find the social character migrant worker in an urban setup, they never remain a homogeneous group. They must be a heterogeneous group. The cities like Bombay, Calcutta, Delhi, Madras, we find that they become a part of a heterogeneous culture, and migrant group, we can't say they are specifically a homogeneous group, rather they are the heterogeneous group. They retain their heterogeneity because they come from different linguistic states and also different cultural zone with different ethnic, cultural and economic background. However, even though becoming heterogeneous, they maintained their specific cultural tradition within the city, and to find themselves comfortable in a city, they usually try to get accommodation or a housing in those places where they find the people with their own ethnic orientation are available. So we find a kind of interlinkages between the ethnicity and the slum development in our country. So migrants usually become distinct cultural tradition in the town, and various groups have maintained their own cultural tradition and cultural identity, even being a part of this heterogeneous culture. And they try to usually cluster around the people with whom they have the linguistic, local, regional, caste or ethnic ties. And simultaneously, another important part is that they remain close ties with their kinship and the caste group for socializing, for transmitting, for receiving information from the village, and also for their social security. So despite being a part of a heterogeneous culture, they try to retain their homogeneity, and in the process of this interaction between the heterogeneous culture and homogeneity, they try to develop a new kind of a cultural formulation. One important part is that besides getting employment in the unorganized sector, majority of the migrant laborer, they try to get accommodation in the slum areas, and which is as I told in earlier, that is 19% of urban population of India live in the slum areas, and slums are characterized by low quality housing, many times without water and electricity, without healthcare and educational facilities, and many times they become the hubs of crimes and social frustration and kind of non-conformist behavior. But despite all those things, what we find that migrant laborers keep on contributing to the urban growth in most of the cities, because they make themselves available, readily available at the cheap pool of the labor force, because the minimum wage, even those are settled, many of the time those minimum wages are also many of them are deprived of the minimum wages. Even though those are there, they are available to get the minimum wage in the urban areas, and they also simultaneously, by becoming the pool of cheap labor force, they widely contribute to the in all areas of the urban activities. It may be the domestic sector, it may be in the construction, it may be in the manufacturing. At times they contribute to the smooth running of the city by maintaining the upkeep of the city, its garden, its drainage system, so many other kind of services it keeps on giving. But despite giving all those services in the urban areas, the process of their skill development in urban setup has remained quite low, because most of them migrate from the rural to the urban areas in search of employment for a livelihood security, and they are unable to make that opportunity cost which is required to go for education and skill development immediately, because if they are to go for education and skill development, they will have to deprive their family members of the food and other livelihood security. So what we find that a huge kind of opportunity cost also involved in the process of their staying in the city and becoming part of this urban unorganized cheap pool of labor force. If we look into if we to look into the urban laborer, especially the migrant laborer, we have to look into migrant laborer as a kind of a from a sociological perspective, how to comprehend it. The migrant workers sociologically, that is, they are coming from diverse cultural groups, so we can't define them in terms of a specific cultural group representing certain cultural phenomenon. We can't define them in terms of specific economic criteria, that is okay, they belong to particular this criteria, or in terms of educational criteria or geographical criteria. What is usually talked about, that is, even I strongly accept this view that migrant laborer are to be looked into as a manifestation of a marginal culture. Rather, marginal laborer are the migrant laborer are the marginalized people. If the migrant laborer are the marginalized people, we have to look into what are the parameters of marginalized people. Marginalized people are looked into in terms of the number one criteria of denial and deprivation. They are deprived of economic security in terms of minimum wage, in terms of livelihood security, in terms of regular employment. That is economic insecurity linked to marginalized people. They are also linked to marginalized social status. Marginalized social status in that way, they are mostly from the lower rung of the society, and they will seldom get the opportunity to get integrated with the upper strata of the society. Politically, they will remain unrepresented, underprivileged, and they will remain underdog. So if we look into the social, economic and the political phenomenon, we find that they represent the marginalized section of the society. Even simultaneously, what we look into the phenomenon, that is, culturally also they are the marginalized man, because they remain in the periphery of the urban society. They will never be able to get integrated. They are not integrated in the cultural society. They remain at the cultural others, not the cultural we. Many sociologists talked about they are the marginal man. They live in two culture but not integrated to none. Two culture in that way. If they want to go back to the village, they will not be able to get integrated with the village culture, and if they remain in the urban areas, they don't get integrated with the urban culture. So it must be the urban, marginal man in the urban setup. So what we find, the representation widely comes in terms of livelihood insecurity, illiteracy, and ill health, and also they become the victims of widely the natural calamities, disease, pandemic, and endemic. So how do you find when there are any outburst of any natural calamity, may it be the drought, if it's a drought, they migrate from the rural to the urban areas, the disaster, earthquake, the flood and famine, they become again dislodged from their own home and disease. And also if endemic and pandemic, they become again the victims of return migration, push back migration to the rural areas. So simultaneously, they also suffer from the problem of the state apathy. So what is we found that recently this outbreak of this pandemic, there has been enormous process of return migration of the migrant laborer in various parts of this country. That is from all the metro cities. There has been enormous returning back to the own village by this laborer, by undertaking a uphill hazardous journey from even urban to the rural areas, risking their life in all possible way, by remaining starved for several days. Many times they encountered the death, and so all this phenomenon, what we find that as a marginal man, the marginalized people, the migrant workers, has always invited the state attention, that is what kind of development initiative could be there for their well-being and integration in the society. As you told, that marginal migrant worker, they are the worker from the rural areas. To stop their migration from the rural to the urban areas, starting from 1947, varieties of the developmental initiatives were initiated. These are linked to land reform in 1952s, the Bhudan movement in 1950s, the community development program, the integrated rural development program 1978, the 20-point program and revised 20 program of 1975, the training of the rural youth for self-employment, National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, Pradhan Mantri's Sadak Yojana scheme, Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana scheme. So varieties of the scheme of the rural development has been initiated in the country to stop the migration of the migrant at the rural area itself. Recently, what we find that Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme has got wider popularity to stop the migration of the rural people from the rural to the urban areas. And but the migration still now continues. So, some of the suggestions that how this migration can be stopped and how the migrant worker can be can be empowered in the society. The first process is that the migrant workers are to be empowered and treating them not as a migrant but as a citizen of the place where they are migrating. Once somebody treated as a citizen, they are entitled for certain citizenship rights. So that treatment should be extended to the migrant workers to get all the benefits, all the developmental initiative. And that needs a kind of a registration of the migrant worker, both from the place of origin and of the place of arrival. So what is important that migrant workers movement need to be recorded from point 1, that is point of origin, point of departure to the point of arrival. And there is to be a kind of a skill development initiative for the migrant workers so that they can get themselves settled with the job which they are doing. And also there should be educate facilities for the education of their children, children of the migrant worker. And there should be all possibilities for ensuring the minimum wages and the social securities in terms of the health, provident fund and other kind of benefits which is meant for laborer as per the citizenship right, that those are to be provided. So what is important that at this stage that all initiative which is taken by the state, those are to be made public, made known to this migrant worker, so that migrant workers can be treated as a citizen. So let us sum up whatsoever we have discussed today. We have discussed number one, that migration is a part of urbanization process in India, number one. Number two, the huge quantum of rural labor force regularly keep on migrating from the rural to the urban areas in search of employment, and even migrating to the urban areas, they remain widely socially, economically and culturally insecure, and they are unable to get integrated in both the culture. They remain to be represented as a marginal man and marginal identity in the society. And to break the barriers of this marginality, what is important that there should be effective state intervention in three important components. Number one, there should be proper registration of the migrant laborer from the point of origin to the point of arrival, and there should be social security measures to be implemented for them, and they should be given proper education and training so that they can be total enabler, and they should exercise their choice in terms of getting engaged with certain economic activities in the wider part of the society. And after all, we have to recognize that migrant workers are the citizens of the country, and they should get the citizenship right in terms of appropriate state intervention. Thank you.